However, Robert is going to report some of his findings about the question of the police and the Aborigines, and I'll invite him to speak.
Thank you, Brian. One dead Abo is one less joke. Now that's not a quote from the early 1840s, but it's a piece of graffiti from the 1980s, and I think somewhere along the line our race relations have gone awfully askew. But I'm not going to deal with race relations as such. I'm going to deal with a one-year period from 1840 to 1841, or specifically the year 1841. And the idea which I'm putting forward is that during this year, the South Australian settler and the police were at war with the natives. So this talk is titled At War with the Natives, from the Coorong to the Rufus, 1840 to 1841. I've had to take out some parts of it because otherwise it would be too long, but I'll launch into it. The punitive expedition, led by Police Commissioner Major T.S. O'Halloran against the Milman-Rura natives along the Coorong in August 1840, established the response of the settlers to outbreaks of Aboriginal violence against the European. It came at a time when the colonists were concerning themselves with the condition and treatment of the indigenous race. In the colonial press, a great deal of coverage was given to this subject, and the problems being encountered in dealing with the natives as equal British subjects in respect to the administration of justice, as well as bringing them to Christian civilisation. That is, with the natives' ability to conform. Within a few years of the official settlement of the colony, these difficulties had soon become known as the Aboriginal problem. The Coorong expedition in August 1840 had been successful in subduing troublesome natives who were regarded by the settlers to be outside the reach of ordinary British law. The lesson which was imparted was that the European would not be trifled with. The expedition also succeeded in stimulating the fervent and now bitter divisive debate among the settlers as to the proper treatment of the native race. But it did little, however, to change the settlers' response to outbreaks of native violence against the European. With the frontier expanding out from the settled districts around Adelaide and parties of Europeans journeying overland to the colonies from New South Wales, further violence between the settler and native became inevitable. The inevitability of this violence came from the determination of the insecure settler population to establish their pastoral interests in the country. Scant regard was paid to the displacement of the natives during this exercise, or to the overturn of their traditional food-gathering lifestyle and respect for their customs, particularly their customs of reciprocity. The overland parties further aggravated these problems by demanding the use of native women to gratify their sexual needs, again ignoring the reciprocity or reciprocal agreements, and presenting the Murray natives at the same time with a ready supply of food and the large numbers of livestock which they brought with them. And as the number of overland parties increased, so the relations between native and European deteriorated, and in fact it deteriorated to such an extent that what could best be described as open warfare erupted. The potential for violence between European and native in Australia had long been foreshadowed, but it was hoped that in South Australia at least, a colony founded on model ideals and settled by selected British emigrants, of which we've heard earlier on this morning, that model race relations would be established and the history of South Australia would remain unsullied by deeds of violence against the indigenous race. Except by degree, however, the South Australian experience must be little different to the other Australian colonies. For not only did violence exist between black and white in South Australia, but manifested itself in a series of expeditions which were launched either by or on behalf of the colonists against the natives. These confrontations were, in the main, punitive police expeditions sanctioned or authorised by the colonial government. They were, moreover, deliberately provocative, and from that period, extending from 1840 to the end of 1841 and into 1842, the settlers were at war with the natives. who they considered to be outside the reach of ordinary law. Now, that shouldn't be confused with the natives living around the Adelaide settlement. Police Commissioner Thomas Sholden O'Halloran is a dominant personality during this period, and being more familiar with the military nature of an armed and disciplined contingent of men due to his military background, he displayed an inability to reconcile the civil function of the police department of which he was in command. I would contend that he was a frustrated soldier, and the expeditions which he either led, organised or proposed were military campaigns against a known enemy. The martial belligerency of his administration of the police force was often tempered or disguised, but nevertheless quite apparent. The sense of war prevalent in the colony during this period was a result of a number of contributing factors, and dominant among these was the settlers' own feeling of insecurity. Settler insecurity had first focused upon the presence of supposed illegitimates, and I use the word here illegitimates to describe those people who weren't immigrants, selected immigrants, that is, men of capital and honest men of labour. And they comprise runaway sailors, escaped convicts, ticket of leave men, and probably anyone else who didn't conform. This was a justification for the police being established in South Australia, and it led to a cordon of police stations to protect the Adelaide town and stop the influx of this class of person. But the settlers soon drew focus upon the more obvious, although often less substantiated evidence of native crime and violence. And the police force, which was established through a fear of illegitimates invading the colony, was in turn utilised against the natives. Now, during this period, it was the difficult duty of the police department to first allay the settlers' fears, from whichever quarter they may arise, and convince them to place confidence in the police force. For this to be done, it needed to show a proven capability that it could deal effectively with all criminal activity and afford the colonists with adequate protection. While O'Halloran had been successful in subduing the Coorong natives in August 1840, settlers away from Adelaide who either were without police protection or without confidence in the police force evinced a strong determination of their own that they were prepared to take matters into their own hands when dealing with instances of native lawlessness and unrest. Hence the dilemma for the police and for the colonial government. Now, I'm going to deal with 4 expeditions which occurred in 1841. During the 3-year period there were 7, the first had been to the Coorong, the last 2 in 1842 were to the Port Lincoln district. Now, in chronological order, the 1841 expeditions were, in January, the Alford expedition to the Hutt and Wakefield rivers. In April, the O'Halloran expedition to the Murray. This was followed in May by a private volunteer expedition to the Murray and Rufus rivers. Also in that month, the O'Halloran Morehouse expedition to the Rufus. And finally in July, the Morehouse Shore expedition to the Rufus River. Now, these last 4 expeditions were to a destination which was outside the colony. That is, to a destination which was inside New South Wales. The appropriate authorities in New South Wales were not consulted, except at a later stage. And when action was taken against the natives near the Rufus River, it was taken without proper jurisdiction, and I would also contend that their action was essentially illegal. I would have liked to have dealt with the state of the colony in this year, as well as Gray's suggestions, but I won't have time. Now, the first of the 1841 expeditions was that of Sergeant Alford to the mid-north. Principal landholders who established their pastoral interests in the sparsely settled districts away from Adelaide were often able to exert sufficient influence on the colonial government to request and receive police protection from troublesome natives. It was important that these settlers develop confidence in the police force to deal with native lawlessness and not attempt to deal with such matters themselves. Of concern to the pastoralists was the native habit of burning grass, pilfering supplies, and spearing livestock. And to help defray costs to the police department, the pastoralists were willing to provide the visiting police with rations and accommodation. But by and large, the police department did not have sufficient strength to establish permanent outposts on individual properties this early. They were willing, however, to dispatch police parties to these properties on request to check reports of alleged native depredations. The earliest evidence of this practice is in September 1840, when O'Halloran ordered one sergeant and 3 mounted constables to visit the properties of Gleeson and Morphett in the mid-north of the colony. Gleeson's property was situated on the Hutt River and Morfett's on the Wakefield. These locations are near the present-day sites of Clare and Auburn. The police party was sent to investigate reports that natives had been spearing sheep and cattle. The results of the police expedition in September 1840 and of the actions which they took are not known. It would appear that the police were not successful in subduing the natives around the 2 properties, for a few months later, in January 1841, O'Halloran again dispatched another police party to the same district. This time, the sergeant in charge, Alford, received specific official instructions from his commissioner, which detailed the police role and the purpose for the visit. The instructions stated that the principal duty of the police was, and I quote, "by strict vigilance to prevent the natives from injuring the sheep or cattle. But if they become troublesome and commit depredations in the presence of yourself or party, in that case they must be made prisoners if possible, but with as little violence as may be. Should any of the party be attacked and therefore endangered, they will of course in self-defence repel force by force. It is very important that any natives detected in killing or spearing sheep should be secured, in which case they must be carefully guarded and allowed no chance of escape. Such prisoners are to be immediately brought into town for trial, accompanied by the proper witnesses. A prisoner escaping must not be fired upon, but whilst in custody, should he offer violent resistance and endeavour by desperate means to release himself, in that case the party must repel force by force, even to the measures of extremity." End of quotation. Now, this was only the second occasion that a police party had been sent to provide police protection. And we can probably throw some commas around that word too, for isolated settlers against reported acts of native lawlessness. It was the first time that O'Halloran, as Police Commissioner, had issued specific instructions which detailed both the role and duties of the police on such an undertaking. Alford's expedition was the first major police exercise against the natives since O'Halloran's punitive expedition to the Coorong the previous year. The instructions which Alford received should be examined closely. Alford's expedition was far more than a simple preventative exercise. Its objective was twofold. First, it was to win the confidence of the settlers and the ability of the police to deal with native lawlessness. Second, to achieve the purpose of the first, it was provocative, for its intent was to force a confrontation with the natives which would then enable positive police action to be taken, as set out in the instructions. Thus, settler confidence would be won and the natives subdued. It is very difficult to believe, no matter how ignorant the natives might be of the European, that they would readily commit depredations in the presence of an armed contingent of mounted uniformed police. The expedition was martial more than civil, barely disguising the belligerency, as I've just said, of O'Halloran's native policy. If successful, the natives around the Hutt and Wakefield rivers would soon learn a series of important lessons relative to the power of the white man in his civilisation. The principal lesson was the same as that which O'Halloran had instilled upon the Milmenrura people. The white man was not going to be trifled with. The departure of Alford's police party from Adelaide was unheralded in the colonial press. The protector of Aborigines, similar to the Coorong expedition, was not included, nor was the native interpreter. Their exclusion, whether deliberate or unintentional, perhaps adds further weight to the belief that the purpose of the exercise was provocative. Considerations for the establishment of friendly relations between white and black appears of little importance. The result of the expedition is not known. That there are no existing reports available, that no mention of the expedition was made in the colonial press, indicates that perhaps the party did not succeed in either provoking a confrontation with the natives or apprehending any native suspects. Morehouse, protector of Aborigines, visited the district in October to meet with Aboriginal people and inspect special surveys. He records no adverse comments on the police or complaints from the natives. Settler confidence in the police in these areas had still to be won. In the criminal sessions of the Supreme Court held in Adelaide during March 1841, it became evident that crime in the colony was steadily increasing. So too was the population. But of alarm and concern to the colonists was the observation passed by the presiding judge. He commented that, on the present occasion, he was unable to impute the major portion of blame for the rising crime rate upon the illegitimate class. Indeed, of the 31 cases tried at this session, the emigrants learnt, to their embarrassment, the following criminal statistics, which could have been broken down into class categories, showing that persons arriving overland amounted for 10, sailors 6, natives 1, and the emigrant 14. The emigrant was shown to be as adept at committing crime as was the illegitimate. The sole native who had been charged with an offence considered serious enough to warrant his appearance before the Supreme Court appeared to answer an allegation of theft. His crime was to steal a piece of mutton from a butcher's shop. The rising crime rate could no longer be attributed to this other class of person. But while the natives were generally quiet in and around Adelaide, it was along the overland route from New South Wales, which followed the Murray River, that serious disturbances were arising between native and European. Conflict had been simmering in this area since the first overland parties had ventured to the colony. Here it was that the native race was most populous due to the abundant supply of food and water. Abuse of these tribes by the overlanders and the temptation which a small party of Europeans escorting large droves of sheep and cattle through their territory provided made conflict inevitable. In April 1841, news reached Adelaide that an overland party led by ex-police superintendent Henry Inman, who was the first officer in charge of the police force until he got the sack for dishonesty, and a Mr. Field from the Royal Navy, had been attacked by natives along the Murray. From the reports reaching a settlement, it was believed that one or more of the party had been severely wounded, and a large number of sheep brought to the colony had been dispersed. This attack, made on an overland party bringing livestock to the colony, was of a far different nature to the murder by natives of the survivors of the hapless Maria. What appeared threatened to the colonists in this instance was the very commercial viability of the colony itself, as well as the safety of Europeans to traverse the country at will. Their consequent response was spurred more through insecure outrage than reasoned argument. No real inquiry was made as to ascertain why such an attack should have taken place, for as far as the colonists were concerned, when news reached them, it was an unprovoked act of aggression. Rumours arising from the excited news spread quickly through the settlement to such an extent that the Register, which had first published the report, found itself compelled to comment that, quote, "The further it travelled, the more alarming it became, for the common principle that the correctness of a report diminishes in a ratio corresponding to the distance is frequently illustrated in Adelaide." End of quote. Inman had been speared 3 times by the natives during the attack. One of the overland party had been killed, and 5,000 sheep being brought to the colony dispersed. To the colonists, this incident was little other than an act of war. Their response was predictable. They dispatched the belligerent police commissioner and a strong contingent of mounted police to the scene. Gawler instructed O'Halloran that he should endeavour to recover the sheep and capture some of the natives responsible for the attack. How suspected natives were to be tried in the courts was not known. Gawler counselled against the use of undue violence, but O'Halloran was left very much to his own devices and was unhindered by the protector of Aborigines or natives who could interpret the Upper Murray dialect. On this occasion, O'Halloran was not dispatched to administer summary justice upon suspected natives, at least not officially. But there can be little doubt that, similar to Alford's recent expedition to the mid-north, O'Halloran's present expedition to the Murray sought to provoke a confrontation with the natives responsible. the police commissioner would act in a similar manner to the way he had instructed his sergeant, who, by the way, accompanied him. O'Halloran embarked to answer belligerence with belligerence, because the white man would not be trifled with. Such had been the excited response to the news of the native attack, which had led to the hurried dispatch of the police contingent, that the exact location of the affray and the fact that it had occurred not in this colony, but inside New South Wales, was not considered. Perhaps this fact was not known, but any actions which O'Halloran's party took against the natives at the scene of the attack would be without jurisdiction. The South Australian Police Force embarked to provoke a confrontation with the native residents of New South Wales. O'Halloran did not in fact reach the scene of this native attack, confront the natives, capture suspects, or even recover any of the sheep. On the 30th of April, when within 50 miles of the scene, he was suddenly recalled by Gawler. Although the orders were greeted with shock and dismay by the party, they were obeyed. And O'Halloran wrote in his diary, quote, "I have no alternative, as an old soldier, than to obey His Excellency's orders, who, of course, has his own just reasons for ordering me back, and which it is my duty not to question, but to obey." On his return to Adelaide, he learnt that Gawler had been replaced by Grey as the new governor of the colony. The sudden recall of the police party when so close to their objective was met with angry indignation by the colonists in Adelaide. That the settlers would take matters into their own hands, should they lose confidence in the police and government to deal with native lawlessness, now became an obvious fact. The settlers sent out a private expedition from Adelaide on May the 7th to accomplish what the police had failed to achieve. The stated objective of this private party was to recover the sheep. In its issue on May the 22nd, the Register reported that, quote, a party of private gentlemen, sufficiently disgusted at so glaring a disregard of the most important interests of the colony, resolved to make an attempt to recover the sheep, and about 14 of them, well armed, proceeded to the Murray, end of quote. There could be no mistaking the mood of the colony. This volunteer party of angry adventurers was the first private punitive expedition launched against the natives by the colonists. Those fears alluded to by Grey in his suggestions, which were published in the Register during Gawler's regime, as to how to deal with the natives, and by O'Halloran in an earlier quarterly report, now became a reality. Open warfare between settler and Aboriginal appeared imminent. No move was made to stop this group, and they were without any authority, martial or civil, no matter how contentious, should they succeed in provoking a confrontation with the hostile Murray natives. In any conflict, they could only resort to self-defence, a spurious justification in the circumstances. A confrontation between the private party and hostile natives did develop near the scene of the attack on Inman and Field's overland party on the Rufus River, which is near the southwestern corner of Lake Victoria in New South Wales. There, they were confronted by a large number of hostile natives, estimated to be in the vicinity of some 500. The natives were not intimidated by the 14 Europeans, and in the battle which ensued, the brother of Field from the Royal Navy was wounded, 2 horses killed, and the party quickly ran back to Adelaide. The private party did not succeed in recovering any of the sheep. What they did succeed in doing, however, was to further exacerbate the present crisis in the colony. The new governor had arrived in a colony which was in a high state of agitation and financial chaos, and where private individuals were prepared to disregard the formal institutions of law and order and take matters into their own hands. Further, the colonists were at war with the natives. In the last encounter, at least 5 natives were reported to have been killed. The number was probably higher. The new governor on his arrival in the colony, found himself confronted with a crisis now of some magnitude. Not only were the financial affairs of the colony in disarray, but the colonists themselves appeared to have lost confidence in the government, the courts, and the police to deal with these acts of native lawlessness. Grey, however, would not be intimidated or influenced by the angry settlers and adopt extreme measures to deal with the crisis as had his predecessor. Grey was in control of the colony, not the colonists, and of this fact he soon left little doubt. As in moments of earlier crises which had beset the colony, it was common practice for the settlers to convene a public meeting to consider what was to be done. This meeting was held on May the 24th, 1841, and there the colonists resolved to present Grey with a memorial which called upon him to, I quote, "take the promptest measures to protect parties now on their way with stock to this colony against the assaults of the natives, and offering a volunteer force to aid the authorities on this expedition, so vitally needed to punish the outrages committed upon our countrymen and restore unto them their property." End of quote. The Murray natives near the Rufus River, it would appear, had already been tried and found guilty by the colonists. Only Grey questioned the wisdom of overland parties venturing through such hostile territory at this moment, which could only lead to more encounters with the natives and more bloodshed, until some official measures had been made to either appease or subdue them. But the colonists demanded retribution. The memorialists from this meeting called upon Grey to provide police assistance to another volunteer force against the natives. That is, they were not offering their assistance to the police, but demanding police assistance for a volunteer force, and it would appear to be a blatant challenge to the authority of the colonial government and its ability to administer law and order. To these representations, Grey responded diplomatically, but with such firmness that no doubt would remain as to who was in control. He would not be swayed by excited and frightened settlers to allow extreme measures to be adopted, over which he could exercise little control. He replied to them that, quote, "if their intention is to act as special constables under the provisions of the statute, for such time and in such manner as shall seem fit and necessary for the preservation of the public peace, and for the protection of the inhabitants and their security of property in this province, His Excellency highly approves their zeal. And as the larger number of Europeans is, who proceed to the point where the late violent acts took place, the less probability there will be of further bloodshed. The magistrate under whose direction the parties are to act will be directed to avail himself of the services of all such gentlemen as may think proper to accompany him." And to further clarify any confusion which might still exist in the settler mind, Grey added, quote, "it is possible that these gentlemen have volunteered their services under the idea that a military expedition against the natives would take place. His Excellency thinks it's proper to state that positive instructions have on several occasions been given by Her Majesty's government to treat the natives of all parts of this continent as subjects of the Queen, within Her Majesty's allegiance, and that to regard them as aliens with whom a war can exist, and against whom Her Majesty's troops may exercise belligerent rights, is to deny that protection to which they derive the highest possible claim for sovereignty." End of quote. Underlying Grey's response to the crisis was his basic belief that the natives were indeed British subjects. A military expedition which exercised belligerent rights could not and would not be used against them. In line with his previously published suggestions relative to the native problem, it was imperative that the natives be made amenable to British law. Grey wished to avoid rash and hasty response to outbreaks of native violence which had in the past been characteristic of the colony. Grey was especially critical of the overland parties who, he told the settlers, quote, "attempt to drive such large herds of cattle and sheep through such extensive tracts of country without taking care that they are much more efficiently guarded than they have hitherto been." Quote, he warned that the present critical financial state of the colony, I quote, "would never suffice to afford protection to all parties who might desire it. They voluntarily encounter a risk from which they are bound to protect themselves." End of quote. Grey did, however, express sympathy with the settlers' obvious concern, but he pointed out that his government had first to act in concert with that of New South Wales. That is, the proper authorities had to be consulted and requisite arrangements made with the New South Wales government so that proper protection for overland parties could be arranged. Grey was envisaging a military or police escort for the overland parties, but he too appears ignorant of the fact that the native attacks had not taken place within South Australia inside the territory of New South Wales. And when Grey corresponded with the Secretary of State, Russell, about the problems which were being encountered with the Murray tribes, this territorial and jurisdictional fact was not raised. To deal with the present crisis which had excited the colonists, Gray authorised Police Commissioner O'Halloran to mount another police expedition. However, this time O'Halloran would be accompanied by the Protector of Aborigines, Matthew Morehouse. Morehouse was elevated to the position of magistrate for the duration of the journey. Native interpreters were also to be procured and would accompany the party as guides. It was hoped that the interpreters, along with Morehouse, would succeed in establishing friendly relations with the troublesome Murray natives. They would also inquire into the circumstances of the recent attacks. Again, the stated objective of the mission was to recover the scattered sheep. Natives responsible for the attacks would be apprehended and brought to Adelaide. In Adelaide, the captured suspects could be identified and would at any rate remain as hostages for the good behaviour of their people. Firearms would be sanctioned only in self-defence. Of the Protector's role, Gray instructed Morehouse that he was to, quote, act as protector and counsel for the natives in any inquiry to be set up, and also to procure the release of one or more prisoners, making it evident that you are their powerful friend, and explaining the white man's intentions. End of quote. On May the 31st, 1841, the official party left Adelaide. In all, it numbered 68 men. There were 15 volunteers, one of whom was Henry Inman. Inman, I don't think, was out to establish friendly relations with the natives. O'Halloran was carefully constrained by Gray's instructions, as well as by the presence of Morehouse. The objectives of the O'Halloran-Morehouse expedition were not realised. The troublesome Murray natives fled before the advancing contingent of armed Europeans. No prisoners or hostages were taken. All that they found were the remains of hundreds of dead sheep near Lake Victoria, as well as the body of an overlander near Langhorne's crossing place on the Rufus River. Morehouse, obviously disappointed, wrote to Gray, quote, I have really had no opportunity of inquiring from the natives themselves the real cause of the contest between the two populations. Quote. The expedition did, however, meet with another overland party. This group, under Langhorne, had been attacked by the natives again near the Rufus. 4 of the 16 men in the party had been killed. One of the survivors stated that they had been attacked by about 500 natives in a battle which lasted for 20 minutes. The natives were willing to attack the small overland parties which brought large herds of livestock, but they were not prepared to attack a large police body. Morehouse provided Gray with a detailed account of the entire expedition. In a dispatch written 205 miles out from Adelaide, he reported how he had endeavoured to establish friendly relations with those natives which they had come across. He learnt from them that several natives had recently been shot by Europeans on horseback. These natives only accompanied the party for about 50 miles, as they were too frightened to continue on into the territory where into the territory of the natives responsible for these attacks. During the return journey, Morehouse, endeavouring to foster friendly relations with the natives, was provided with his first real insight into the nature of the recent conflicts. On one occasion, a less timid native asked Morehouse whether he, or any of his party, desired the company of Aboriginal women. This native told Morehouse that, quote, all the white people that he had seen before had had native women brought for the purpose of sexual intercourse, and whom the Europeans gave them flour, animal food and clothing, quote. Morehouse felt that this was the cause of the native hostility towards the overland parties, and he told Gray, quote, 14 months ago, the Reverend Mr. Leekman and myself were inquiring of a Sydney native who had travelled the overland route twice in 2 years, and he said it was becoming dangerous for Europeans to come overland. He said the blacks were becoming enraged with the whites, for the latter had used the women of the former and much abused them. The abuse, he explained, consisted in the Europeans promising the Aborigines food, clothing and tomahawks for the use of their females. The Europeans did not fulfil their promises. After gratifying their passions, the women were turned out late in the evening or in the night, and instead of the men having their promised rewards, they were laughed at and ridiculed. End of quote. Morehouse obtained a statement from one of the survivors of Langhorne's overland party. This statement went further to support those observations given to Morehouse and Leekman by the Sydney native. The survivor told Morehouse that the taking and using native women was common practice of all overland parties. And to support his contention, the survivor, a man called Miller, stated that he had been on 3 overland parties to Adelaide. During the first journey, the Europeans had found the natives friendly and helpful. The natives neither stole from them, pilfered their supplies, or speared their livestock. On the second overland journey, however, the natives had been more bold and aggressive. Some sheep had been speared, and this had resulted in the overlanders shooting at the natives. The third and last occasion speaks for itself, in the deterioration of the relation between white and black. The Protector had little hesitation in apportioning blame for the native attacks upon the overland parties, and he submitted to Grey, quote, "The overland parties have not acted judiciously in allowing the native women to be brought to their encampments. It was an intimacy that encouraged the natives at once to acquire something at hand of the European. When he received food or clothing, he was acquiring a taste for food that could not be obtained in his savage state. There can be no wonder that when he sees it in the possession of others, he should take it by force, unless there should be sufficient strength to resist it." End of quote. To Morehouse, then, the cause of the native attacks on the overland parties lay with European indiscretion, which led to false Aboriginal expectations that they would receive European food and possessions. Native expectations were satisfied by the use of force to acquire what would not be readily given to them. However, it would appear to me that Morehouse failed to grasp the more fundamental cause of the hostility of the native towards the white man. That is, he failed to recognise the resentment which the European caused by abusing native women, ridiculing the men, and ignoring their ancient customs of reciprocity. The Murray natives were much aggrieved. With the failure of this expedition, Morehouse left the new governor with the following dilemma to ponder. I quote, "Indiscriminate shooting, according to our present knowledge, does not appear to deter the natives on the Rufus from attacking the drays containing provisions. It is the opinion of many colonists that this expedition, having refrained from shooting, has tended to encourage, rather than intimidate the natives in acts of aggression and outrage. As the natives have been victorious in the last 3 contests with the Europeans, there appears at present no means to preventing further collision, but strong numerical force in overland parties. If their force be numerous, they would be at once awed, as they evidently were, when the police force approached." End of quote. Further violent confrontation between overlanders and natives appears inevitable. Frustration. Grey, no less than the other colonists, felt a sense of frustration by the native attacks and the lack of success of the Morehouse-O'Halloran expedition. The natives responsible had not been encountered, prisoners taken, or friendly relations established. The hostile Murray natives were unsubdued. They had not yet been made amenable to British law. There was growing pressure in the colony for a full-scale military punitive expedition to be launched against them. O'Halloran and Gawler had been successful in subduing the Coorong natives regardless of the legal and social niceties, but Grey would not be swayed. He was determined that, quote, "we should allow no circumstances whatever to excite in our breasts a desire for revenge. I can never sanction any mode of punishment which may involve alike the innocent and guilty men, women and children in its consequences." End of quote. Grey's frustration did not lie so much with the problem of how to subdue the Murray natives and make them amenable to British law. He'd already made it clear how this would be achieved. His frustration lay with the persistence of the overland parties to undertake journeys to the colony, knowing full well the dangers involved. Their persistence only further aggravated the crisis before he had time to find a solution. So they forced him to act before he could initiate new moves to sort out the problem. Because yet another overland party, under a man called Robinson, had left Sydney for Adelaide in May. Strong representations were made to Grey on Robinson's behalf by a man called John Ellis, who requested police assistance to provide Robinson's party with safe passage through the troublesome region. This latest overland party consisted of some 26 men and several thousand sheep. Knowing the state of the region, following the lack of success of Morehouse and O'Halloran, as well as the loss of life inflicted on Langhorne's party, Grey was compelled to act to prevent further violence. And so he requested his police commissioner to make ready the necessary men and equipment to go to Robinson's aid. O'Halloran, however, whether through frustration at his own lack of success in dealing with the Murray natives as he might like, or in pique at the manner in which Grey had constrained his actions during the last expedition, as well as the cutbacks in his police force, he proved to be a good deal less than cooperative. To O'Halloran, there's only one real effective method of dealing with the present crisis. It was to launch a full-scale military operation against them. This Grey would never allow, but O'Halloran was persistent. He sent Grey a submission which advised against sending another expedition to the Murray at that time due to the weather. It was winter. Rain, muddy roads and strong river currents would hamper any expedition sent to the Rufus and Darling rivers during those months. He contended that his men would be hindered and harassed. What O'Halloran envisaged was a well-planned military campaign, and he told Grey, quote, to ensure with certainty the success of an expedition sent to punish or capture the blacks, it will be absolutely necessary to send not only a couple of whale boats, but likewise 2 strong mounted parties on either side of the river. He suggested that the month of October would be a more appropriate time to launch this campaign, and it would last for several months. And he submitted, quote, preparation ought to be made for a campaign of several months, for though both sides of the river can then be scoured, the natives have still innumerable creeks, lagoons and scrub to hide in, and where it will require much time and patience to find them, unless they are willing to be seen. No one was going to get away. And then, as though to further frustrate Grey's urgent request, O'Halloran declared his department hard-pressed and stated, quote, the greater part of the mounted police are required to attend as witnesses at the sessions early next month, and the greater number of the horses, from lameness, bad feed and sword backs, are at present inefficient and require some rest to render them effective again, end of quote. But Grey had no intention of authorising any military campaign against the natives. Critical though he had been of Robinson's overland party, he still saw the urgent need to rescue them if possible and prevent further bloodshed. Not so O'Halloran. However, Grey dismissed O'Halloran's suggestions and ordered his police commissioner to make ready the necessary men and equipment. But O'Halloran would not be balked, and he replied that it was, quote, quite impossible in the present state of town and country, and upon the reduced strength, to spare a man to send with the volunteers about to proceed to the Murray to meet and protect Mr. Robinson's overland sheep party, end of quote. It was apparent that if O'Halloran could not have his way in dealing with the natives, then he would frustrate Graham Morehouse to the utmost, even at the cost of European lives. As if to emphasise this point, as well as his displeasure with Grey's cutback of his department, O'Halloran suggested that those police who were about to be disbanded due to the cutbacks complement Grey's intended expedition. He would not make available his permanent men, or their horses, or equipment. So, on the 31st of July 1841, a party consisting of 29 Europeans and 3 natives left Adelaide to meet with Robinson's overland party. Sub-Inspector Shaw, 1 sergeant and 10 foot police who were to have been disbanded from the police force were included in this number. The party was led by Morehouse, Protector of Aborigines and Magistrate. For the first time, a major expedition against the natives crossed the border of South Australia and were in the penal colony of New South Wales. Being near the scene of the recent native attacks, Morehouse assembled the group and repeated the official instructions which Grey had issued to him. Friendly relations were, if possible, to be established. This was not a punitive expedition, and the natives would only be fired upon at the express command of Sub-Inspector Shaw, and then in self-defence. Their mission was to afford Robinson's party safe passage through the hostile native territory. It was not their role to provoke a confrontation with the natives. Their operation was defensive, not offensive. Following Morehouse's speech, the party resumed their march towards Langhorne's Ferry on the Rufus, being the usual crossing place of the overland parties and the scene of the attacks. Here it was that they met Robinson's party on the other side of the river. Their combined force now totalled 55 men. Robinson told Morehouse that on the previous day his party had been attacked by about 300 natives. His party, however, had not been injured, but they had killed at least 5 natives and wounded at least 10 more. Gray's fears as to the outcome of an encounter between a private party of adventurers and the Murray natives were realised. Robinson's journey was little more than a provocative adventure, which was well prepared for the inevitable conflict. After the exchange of pleasantries, Morehouse, Shaw and another rode ahead of the main party to Lake Victoria. Here they suddenly found themselves confronted by a large group of hostile natives who rushed at them, brandishing implements of war. The three Europeans made a hasty retreat. Returning to the main party, Morehouse prepared for an attack by the natives, which appeared imminent. He then gave control of the party to Shaw, authorising him to issue such orders for their safety as he thought necessary. Morehouse did attempt to establish some communication with the hostile natives to prevent the attack. This he did by conversing with three natives who had accompanied his party some of the way. These natives could do little but confirm the determination of their countrymen to attack the Europeans, the consequences be what they may. The natives who had been successful in previous encounters with overland parties were now not deterred by the presence of Morehouse's group. The Morehouse-Shaw contingent was grouped on the western bank of the Rufus River. On the eastern bank was Robinson's party. They faced a group of about 150 natives. On Shaw's command, both parties advanced together towards the natives and commenced firing. Of the subsequent battle, Morehouse reported to Gray, quote, "The firing commenced before a spear was thrown on account of the inequality between the two parties. The natives at least were 150 strong, while the Europeans had only 36 that could be spared. Some natives had 2 or 3 spears. Every spear being equal to a musket is sufficiently near an object to be thrown, and to have waited until the natives were within that distance would have been to expose the Europeans to certain defeat." End of quote. The engagement lasted for 20 minutes. When hostilities ceased, 30 natives lay dead. Tolmer suggests that this number was 50. Only one European, Robinson, was wounded. He had been speared in the left arm. 4 natives were captured, 2 were women, 1 a boy and the other a male adult. The 4 prisoners were assembled in front of the Europeans that following day. Notwithstanding the fact that Morehouse found the dialect totally different to that spoken by the Adelaide natives, he commenced to address them in the following manner, quote, "You have been captured in retreating from a contest your own tribes were guilty of promoting. You were advised, strongly and perseveringly advised, not to rashly attempt what you had no probability of accomplishing. You may learn 2 lessons. First, the immense superiority of the white man over the black in his movements of defence. And second, the destruction of life which took place was not to gratify a destructive propensity, as your lives would not have been spared, but to protect that property which the black man wished unlawfully to obtain. The white man in this instance has shown as much leniency as could have been expected." End of quote. The European was cruel to be kind. It was now time for kindness, and the protector was to prove to the natives that he was their powerful friend. This was in accordance with his earlier instructions. He released 2 of the native prisoners, a woman and the boy, both of whom had been wounded during the battle. The other native woman, whose husband had been killed in the encounter, expressed her wish to become the wife of an accompanying Adelaide native. The remaining male, I quote, "will be taken to Adelaide and kept there for a while, and it will depend upon his tribe what treatment he receives. Should they again attack parties on the road from Sydney, he may possibly be put to death, but if they should be peaceful and quiet, he will be allowed to return." End of quote. A hostage had been taken as guarantee for their good behaviour. Morehouse then promised the natives that, quote, "should you at any future time meet with outrage or insult from Europeans, I advise you, as your protector and friend, not to attempt your own defence. The government has promised to listen to any charges you may have to prefer, and for all aggressions upon your rights, you are promised immediate satisfactory redress." End of quote. Whether the captured and frightened natives could understand the elaborate address of Morehouse isn't known. How they might utilise his services is likewise not apparent. What is apparent, however, is their submission and compliance to the domination of the European. And what is also apparent to both European and native is the inability and ineffectiveness of Morehouse to honour the promises which he made even before he had made them. In the afternoon following the battle with the natives, Cooney, a shepherd accompanying Robertson's party, requested of the betrothed Adelaide native the use of his woman. The previous husband of the woman had been killed by the whites only a few hours earlier. The disturbed Adelaide native sought advice from Morehouse, the professed protector and friend of the Aborigines. Morehouse instructed Cooney that he would not permit such behaviour. Cooney, however, was unperturbed by either the native or Morehouse. 20 minutes later, quote, Cooney had taken the native out of her hut, much against her will, and effected his purpose. Another shepherd immediately after that had intercourse with her, end of quote. European abuse and degradation of the Aboriginal knew no bounds. Morehouse, protector of Aborigines and magistrate, was neither able to protect the Aborigines nor control the Europeans. The above instance, which highlights Morehouse's ineffectualness, was not an isolated incident. During the return journey to Adelaide, Morehouse visited Robertson's shepherds while they were encamped. There he found 3 shepherds having sexual intercourse with native women in the presence of other Europeans, and he was to tell Gray, quote, I threatened them with punishment, but they said there was no law against such practices, and they should not regard any command from their employers to that effect. They were reprimanded, but they still replied that they would do the same again as soon as the opportunity presented itself. End of quote. The protector of Aborigines further told Gray of his hopes of bringing several friendly natives from the Lake Bonney district to Adelaide. However, he complained that on account of the incessant application by the shepherds for native women, he very much doubted that they would continue accompanying his party. Morehouse endeavoured to curb this practice by posting a sentry in front of the native huts at night, with orders to arrest all Europeans who visited them. The success of this move is not known, although no arrests are recorded. When the Morehouse Shore expedition returned to Adelaide, an official inquiry was held to inquire into the circumstances surrounding the actions of Morehouse and Shaw and the subsequent loss of life. O'Halloran, although not participating in the expedition himself, sat on the bench of magistrates. He was no doubt well pleased with the success of the expedition, and at the conclusion of the testimonies moved the following resolution, quote, that the bench of magistrates, after a full and careful examination of all the evidence, are unanimously of opinion that the conduct of Mr. Morehouse and his party were justifiable and indeed unavoidable in the circumstances, end of quote. In seconding the motion, Edward John Eyre acknowledged that the confrontation was unavoidable, but expressed his fears that perhaps the lesson imparted was not yet sufficient to prevent further attacks on the Europeans. To keep the Murray natives subdued and make them amenable to British law, it was decided to establish a police station in the Murray region. Eyre, vested with the powers of the police magistrate, was sent to Murundi, about 80 miles from Adelaide on the Murray. The Morehouse Shore expedition was a watershed, marking the end of native attacks on overland parties and their final bloody submission to the white man. The Murray natives had been subdued, and the task of civilising them now began. Colonial attention turned to focus on troublesome natives to the west, near the newly established settlement at Port Lincoln, and it was now the turn of these tribes to learn the violent lesson that the white man would not be trifled with. I'll just go through a few conclusions. The settlers of South Australia were at war with troublesome natives who they believed to be outside the reach of ordinary British law. The settlers' response to native troubles was first established by Gawler and O'Halloran in their dealing with the Milman-Rura people in August 1840. O'Halloran established the law of war. The police commissioner, O'Halloran, was a frustrated soldier who was unable to reconcile the civil nature of the police department with his military upbringing, and was barely able to disguise the martial belligerency of the methods he advocated and used against the natives. The expeditions against them which he either led, organised or advocated were provocative. Their objective was to force a confrontation with troublesome tribes. A swift lesson would then be dealt. The lesson was always the same. The whites would not be trifled with or hindered in their settlement of the colony. In this early period, the colonists' principal concern was with the rumoured influx of an illegitimate class and with the existence of crime in the colony. Crime was blamed on the illegitimates until the Supreme Court sessions in March 1841. but the illegitimacy threatened their grand schemes of colonisation was the justification for the existence of the police department and for the establishment of a cordon of police stations around the Adelaide settlement. By the end of 1840, the force numbered about 110 men. It is interesting to note that this large number, protecting approximately 6,500 Europeans, was reduced to only 50 in 1844, when the population had increased to about 19,000. Native crime of a serious nature which warranted its inclusion in the crime statistics was small, even considering the small native population. However, native crime soon became the preoccupation of the police department, as well as a significant justification for its existence. Violence, perpetuated by the settler against the Aboriginal, was anticipated and expected. It was accepted as a fact of life and inevitable. However, the government and the police did not set out to curb settler abuse and violence against the indigenous race. Rather, they set out to stringently control the natives, punishing them in an effort to prevent further violent settler retaliation to what would amount to nuisance offences. The dilemma of the colonial government and the police was to win settler confidence in their ability to effectively deal with native lawlessness. Until this was achieved, they knew that the settlers themselves would take matters into their own hands and exact their own vengeance for grievances. This in some way may excuse the hardline attitudes. The accolades for the final battle against the Murray natives did not go to the mounted police and the belligerent O'Halloran. They go to the person whose official position proclaims him friend and protector of the Aboriginal. Foot police who were about to be disbanded, volunteers, and a party of overland adventurers who incited the attack. There is also a matter of jurisdiction to be considered in the official expeditions launched from Adelaide against the Murray tribes. The attacks had not taken place in South Australia. Perhaps it should have been a matter for the New South Wales government, not South Australia, who could at best provide assistance in whatever measures the New South Wales authorities might wish to consider. It would appear that this question of jurisdiction was not considered by the settlers in South Australia. Why it was not considered is not known. But the evidence that the attacks had occurred near the Rufus River and Lake Victoria is not in dispute. Also, the boundaries of the model colony, which had been carved out by an Imperial Act of Parliament, were well known and jealously guarded by the emigrants. One answer could be that, in the agitated state of the colony, the insecure settler was more concerned with subduing hostile natives and avenging losses than with legal niceties. It remains, however, a puzzlement of history and a question of conjecture.
Well done, Robert. Well done indeed. Well, we are running a little late, but I think that we ought to take the time to provide for questions and discussion. Are there any from the floor? And Ron, you've worked with this sort of field.
I commend Robert on a very fine exposition. Listened with great interest. Yes. We've been a little bit interested had he been able to comment a little bit more on, well, particularly the feelings that some Aboriginals had about land problems.
Yes, I would have. I was battling time. I had to take out quite a bit of stuff. 1841 would appear to be a small period in time, but
looks like the crucial moment, you think? Yes. Did I see a question? Yes.
Would have also been interested, again with that of time, to hear more about the Port Lincoln area, because that too seemed to be a war zone.
Yes, it was. Yes, that's that's what I'm doing next.
And it might be helpful, not only is Robert's thesis nearly finished, but there's a BA just been done on Morehouse's Protector. He wrote 6 monthly reports for 15 odd years, and this is being worked over and will soon be in our Flinders Library for viewing, and that will be an additional component in our understanding of the process in this period. Yes. Up the back.
Did New South Wales government take exception to South Australia?
Well, apparently not. For some unknown reason, and I've explored it as fully as possible, but I'd still like to get stuck back into it, that it appears to be no question was raised, either by New South Wales or South Australia. In fact, Gray wrote in length, and so did the New South Wales Governor, to the Secretary of State, all about these incidents, and yet nowhere was in fact alluded to that South Australia and policemen were marching into another colony and shooting up the natives.
Elaine, you want
Would it have been feasible for the New South Wales police to do anything, or if not, was that the explanation? It was pragmatic sort of.
Well, perhaps, but
Where was the nearest New South Wales police force?
well, I'm not sure, but you would have thought that there would have been some discussion entered into, because they almost tried to justify what they did, and this one is she's blank.
The gold escort might be worth looking at to see what role our troopers played on the goldfields.
Yes.
Whether they exercised any authority there. Whether it was just taken as a matter of course that they could trespass.
You mentioned the fact that they were taking hostages. Was this a frequent sort of thing that they attempted to sort of get their way by this, purely illegal means?
Yes, I don't know how frequent it was, but it certainly happened in that instance. I believe it happened on a few other occasions. Ron might be able to fill in a little bit more, but the point is it happened, and at least once that it's officially recorded. I suspect that it happened on quite a few occasions, but not in such a blatant manner.
I don't know about the hostages so much, but certainly your references to the use of Aboriginal women seem to be the consistent theme running right through many of these problems. That were down on the Coorong, I recall, where sealers and whalers had taken Aboriginal women forcibly before white settlement even began in South Australia.
Wakefield was right, wasn't he? Equal proportion was a prudent
Distribution was the next problem.
Yes,
I mean, you had all those
yes,
women in the destitute asylum.
Yes,
you had all those men on there.
Yes, correct.
Any other questions?
Yes.
How strong is the evidence for an intention of provoking a confrontation in the first two of the expeditions that you talked about? I wonder how strong the evidence is, because if in fact there's not much evidence and you start with an assumption that in fact there isn't an incident provoked, it seems to me you're on fairly shaky ground.
Tenuous ground, yes. I acknowledge that fact. But from my own understanding as an operational, well, I have been an operational police officer for a couple of years, and getting some sort of idea about a police mentality, and interpreting instructions. Now those instructions are fantastic. They would appear to the layman to sound all very nice and proper, but when you look at them, to see natives committing depredations in your presence, I mean, what a load of trash. Natives aren't going to go around spearing sheep when you've got 3 or 4 mounted policemen standing by. They have to go out and search for them and push them. And I know that some of this ground may be shaky, but I believe that I'm possibly on the right track.
It wouldn't just be a question of spearing also, because I should imagine they would also take, if they found carcasses in native possession. So that's the classic instrument in WA. You don't have to see a native spearing. All you have to do is find them in possession of bones.
Yes. Later on, during the period I'm looking at, the police became rather notorious for getting with the settlers and shooting at natives when they just need their livestock. And then they would justify it nicely for the reports, but I reckon I'm on the right track. Because the only way to deal with the natives, to bring them to law, to introduce them to the power of the white man, is to have a little bit of a confrontation, and then you have an excuse to wade in, lock them up, and take hostages and really stamp down, and bring them before the courts. Bring them to Adelaide, show them the Adelaide city or the Adelaide town, show them the might of the white man and his civilisation. Get them on the rations as soon as possible, and so you can preach them Christianity and pray over their graves.
You've got some further evidence in later actions in the Northern Territory.
Yes, or in Skinner's book in southern Queensland in the 1850s. It's exactly consistent in both cases, isn't it? Yes.
The accepted way to get a good night's sleep, so some bushmen came to Northern Territory, was simply to walk within a radius of a mile of your camp and shoot everything that moved, or turn the dogs loose.
Rob, I'm not sure how to put this, but what kind of influence do you think the lack of
communication in the sense that there was a language barrier has added to these problems. I mean, even if they did take along, say, Aborigines who had some idea of the language, it seems to me that even those Aboriginal interpreters would have been lacking in being able to speak English fluently. How can you even put some concepts of white society and concepts of Aboriginal society into words, let alone with limited vocabulary?
Well, it's very difficult. That's why I place significance on the fact that some of these expeditions didn't have native interpreters to even make an attempt. And like the one where they went up to the hut in the Wakefield, they were just policemen. With specific orders, they would know how to talk the native language. They probably weren't interested. They were out there to administer a bit of law and order. It is a big problem, and a lot of these elaborate speeches by the white man, I don't know how they were interpreted. I suppose that the native stood around and nodded his head and had a good time, but it probably went in. Well, it'd be very difficult for him to understand exactly what was going on.
Any other questions?
Well, thank you.